Everything about the Hizmet movement that I have experienced, the people and the actions of the movement, are of loving, caring, giving people whose acts of charity and generosity are just staggering. Substantial activities of Hizmet. As a guest of Hizmet was one of the most profound and moving experiences. I'm Gareth Young. I live in Atlanta and have done for a little over 20 years. I'm the father of two almost adult children. I'm a businessman. I serve in a number of not-for-profit social justice organizations, very active in interfaith, and I'm an author and a blogger. I've known people active in the Hizmet movement for many years. I came to know them through my interfaith work. A couple of years ago, I was invited by the people who I know in the Hizmet movement, who I've met through the interfaith work, to go on a trip to Turkey as a guest. And I was just blown away by what I saw. I had heard of the good work they did, but visiting schools and hospitals and studios and the groups who do refugee work, it was really just deeply moving. My experience with Hizmet has been of just wonderful people doing wonderful work. They are, as I understand it, inspired by a Sufi teacher, Fethullah Gulen, who lives in Pennsylvania. He's a Turkish Sufi teacher. And I have read some of his work, which I think is just beautiful and epitomizes what I understand as the meaning of Islam. I don't know him personally. It's very difficult for me to talk about Fethullah Gulen as an individual. But I do recognize, most of the time I recognize people through their influence on others and by the people who congregate around them. And the people who I know, and there's a fair number of them who congregate around Fethullah Gulen, are just extraordinarily beautiful, very loving and giving people. My understanding of and my experience of the Hizmet movement is of small local communities. So these are groups who are autonomous, who raise money locally, make decisions locally, and act locally. And at that local level, which is city level here in the States, city level elsewhere in the world, and also obviously in Turkey, schools are built, hospitals are built. And as I've come to understand the fundraising process, it's a beautiful one. It's kind of a blind pool. It's like, we've got this great idea, we want to build a school. Present it to the board or the body of donors, and they say, that's a great idea. Here's your money, off you go. So it's the accountability is a very informal accountability, and it's a beautiful model. It's one based on love and trust. So the contributions are the obvious good of education and social justice, and love and care for other people. But above all, I think the contribution is just that model. It's the local community model of figuring out what matters in our local community and acting as a community to deal with those things for the betterment of the community. As a non-Muslim, one has to tread carefully when talking about another faith, and here Islam in particular. But I have met with great generosity from Muslims, particularly those Turkish Muslims I know from the Hizmet movement here in Atlanta. I've read the Quran a couple of times. What I take as the central message of Islam is one of love, regardless, and one of generosity, regardless. Everything about the Hizmet movement that I have experienced, the people and the actions of the movement, are of loving, caring, giving people whose acts of charity and generosity are just staggering. Hizmet is a movement, and there's a distinction between a movement and most of what happens in social justice. A movement, as I look at it, is a group of people who stand behind an idea and act based on the principles and the ideas. And it is done without necessarily having recourse to organization. Most of the social justice work that I have come across tends to either be local modular stuff, which is fairly small and not able to really get to scale or make a big difference in the world, or it becomes organizational in structure and builds layers and becomes monolithic. Hizmet has found that wonderful balance of retaining its characteristics as a movement. And so there's this, when I was a guest on a trip to Turkey, I experienced the brotherhood and sisterhood of hospitality of friends in other cities who are associated with the movement, but not part of an organization. It was very informal, but very generous, and it worked incredibly well. So Hizmet retains those characteristics of a movement, the grassroots, where it's about what you do, not about the organization or about position in the organization and those kind of things, while operating at a staggering level of scale and influence. One of the most important things in my life is interfaith work. I'm a blogger, I write about that, I'm heavily involved in a lot of local interfaith activities, I'm involved in many local interfaith organizations. And I have gotten to know a number of people from the Hizmet movement through their interfaith activities. So they get involved in the things I get involved in. And I have also attended a number of Atlantic Institute Hizmet organizational meetings. Hizmet works very, very well with the local community. It involves everybody who's of compatible mind. The interfaith activities that Hizmet puts on in town are cross-cultural, cross-faith, they're open platforms, they're conversations, getting to know people. The environments are created where people of cultural, racial, and religious difference come together, sit in a room together, share tables, share a meal together, and hear a conversation and participate in a conversation at their tables around difference and get to know each other across difference. This, to me, is the heart of what interfaith is about. And the Hizmet movement is in full command of that and does a wonderful job of it. The world will always have difficulties. There will always be bad eggs, so to speak. There'll always be, problems and challenges. My belief is that in a world where we protect ourselves by building walls and by communing only with people who are like us, the perception across those boundaries we create becomes very, very difficult, and it's very easy within that environment for us to have large-scale differences and for large groups of people to rally around those differences and to have really ugly conflict. In a world where we work on taking down the barriers and on having conversations and getting to know people intentionally regardless of difference, or intentionally even because of difference. In a world where we create those kind of relationships, the barriers don't pop up so easily, and it's much more difficult for polarizing groups, minority groups scattered around, to create a critical mass where they can cause a lot of harm. They'll always be there. But in a world in which we intentionally build these conversations, they're going to be less powerful and less able to really cause problems. So for so long as organizations like Hizmet are in the world creating environments for these conversations, facilitating and enabling cross-cultural, cross-faith conversations, I am very optimistic that we'll live in that second world where the problems will kind of bubble up and bubble down again rather than be allowed to become major issues. One of the main areas of emphasis of Hizmet as it's presented and as I've experienced it is education. And the principle that I understand that being founded on is once we get to know things, once we get to know each other, once we get to know facts, the opportunities for misunderstanding and the opportunities for division and animosity are diminished. I share a view that education is a very, very important part of a platform of bringing down barriers, of creating understanding across the faith and racial and other boundaries that are potentially troublesome in our world today. One of the substantial activities of Hizmet is around disaster relief, helping people in need. When I was in Turkey on a trip, I experienced that directly. We visited a foundation whose work was precisely around that, and we were in East Turkey, just north of the Syrian border, just north of what was then a conflict zone and refugee camps. And I came to understand a lot of what Hizmet does in that area. It is quite profound. And there's a lot of just wonderful work coming out of Hizmet to support disasters and poverty and injustice around the world. It's always easy to criticize things as needing improvement. It's always easy to look for things that could be done better. My experience of the Hizmet movement, as to the things it does, it just does extremely well. My trip to Turkey, everything was singing. It was, the movement was at scale and was continuing to grow and have a profound and positive social impact. Opportunities, perhaps. There is the cultural transition of that model into the US where I live, which I'd love to see. I'd love to actually help make that happen. It's in the process of happening. It will happen, I think, but it's just going to take time. One of the deepest challenges for Hizmet right now, and I candidly don't know quite the right way to deal with this, is what's going on in Turkey and the experience of those participants in the movement in Turkey. My conversations with members of the Hizmet movement in the US, where I've offered support for that, and said, what can we here do to help Turkey, has been itself profoundly moving, because the response has been a very deep spiritual response, actually, of all we can do is just continue to live our lives in accordance with our principles. Exude love, exude goodwill, and do acts of justice and goodness in the world, and just trust. I think it's a real challenge to figure out how to deal with what's going on in Turkey right now. I think the response I've heard is the right response. But there's just a little piece inside me says there should be a little bit more, there should be something stronger here, and I don't know what that would be. One of the things Hizmet does locally in the US is to offer hospitality to local community members, to non-Turks. Building bridges and building relationships really has to start by going and meeting the other in the place where they feel comfortable. And members of the Hizmet movement certainly do that. They do a lot of activities in churches and in educational establishments and synagogues. So the Hizmet movement is getting out and meeting people. But they're also inviting others back to more Turkish environments. An example of this, which happens for a month every year, is inviting people to iftar dinners. There are also regularly events at Hizmet founded and operated physical establishments, buildings. And those are typically intentionally interfaith. So they're intentionally educational, where there's a conversation set up to say, hey, we're Turkish, we're Muslim, this is kind of a little bit of our culture and our environment here. Let's talk about yours as well. So I find those both very helpful in themselves in helping to bridge cultural and faith differences between the Turkish expat community, which is the core of Hizmet, and those who are not Turkish, not Muslim, but who are mostly people who share similar values, because those are the kind of people who are drawn. But I also find that that is a tremendous model for everybody else. And it's a model I try and use in other conversations and other activities that I'm engaged in, of not just doing this with Turkish populations, but doing it with other populations. So there's a lot of good to be learned from those activities.
I think also non-Muslims around the world have been able to see Islam in a new way through Hizmet, in a way that's positive, in a way that's open, in a way that's interrelational, in a way that's about neighbors coming together and valuing each other rather than, cultures in conflict.
I'm very impressed by Hizmet's ability to extend itself in education and its emphasis upon education.